What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my favorite indie games, or at least the top 7 or so, because as somebody who reviews a lot of games, I am fortunate enough to get the opportunity to experience a whole host of indie titles, and what I really enjoy about that experience, more than at least usual anyway, is that indie games have the opportunity to surprise you or do really fun things, or perhaps simply do something in a way you didn't necessarily expect or see coming, which does lead to this sense of freshness that you don't always get with much larger releases that certainly tend to play things a little more on the safe side in terms of decisions. And while I have talked plenty of times about various indie games, in fact, usually about once a year I will go over what I think were the best indie games I played that year, what I have surprisingly not done is actually just talked about what my personal favorites are overall, which is obviously what this video is going to be, but if you watch like every single day, I would imagine that you've heard me talk about at least a few of these on occasion, but be it unique gameplay elements or just general vibe or experience that I hadn't really gotten anywhere else, these games all brought something unique to the table, and that's why they're on this list, for myself at least, obviously. But given how there are more indies releasing basically every month than you will likely ever play, there is of course certainly plenty of room for debate on the matter. Either way though, let's go ahead and dive into this thing, and first we are kicking it off with Geneforge 2. Now, Geneforge 2 is from Spiderweb Software, and I have played a fair few of Spiderweb Software's games at this point, but hardly all of them, and with that in mind, Geneforge 2 has been by far my favorite. In fact, when I reviewed Geneforge 2 Infestation, I believe I mentioned that it would probably be one of my favorite stories in gaming, period, just because of how much I loved it. But the general premise of Geneforge as a series is that you play as a wizard known as a Shaper who can shape life, which comes with all sorts of incredibly uncomfortable, at times I would say, questions about the morality of what those people are doing. And it does so in a really compelling way, and it's really that I love so much about Geneforge 2. The story surrounding exactly those things and about the implication of what those people are doing and how the things they are creating wind up feeling about it, even if they were not intended to have feelings to begin with. And that's all sorts of just interesting questions being asked, and I think Geneforge 2 does a fantastic job of following up on what the first game established and showing all the ways that things can go very, very wrong with this kind of thing. And so, while I will be the first person to tell you that it is not exactly the most exciting thing to play in terms of actual gameplay, I think the story hard carries Geneforge 2, which is a fantastic experience in that regard at least. But moving on to our second entry, we then have SKALD Against the Black Priory, a Lovecraftian sort of horror-esque CRPG inspired by things like Ultima, but there are a lot of things I enjoy about this one. For starters, I'm almost always up for a Lovecraftian adventure, big fan of that kind of thing, but what I really love is actually just the atmosphere of these islands you're sailing around as you're trying to get to the bottom of a mystery that spans all of these different situations and tragic ills that have befallen all of the places you are going to go, and you're going to meet a lot of broken people along the way, while also picking from classes and building your characters to fight back against the eldritch horrors of these isles while you are at it. So simply put, there's a lot to love about SKALD, but more than anything, I think it's just a really fun sort of retro RPG. And I think more than anything, it just speaks to my specific interest particularly well, which is why it's on this list. Coming in at number 3, however, we then have Drova, Forsaken Kin, which is a title that released almost 1 year ago in October of 2024, but then received a bunch of updates afterwards that I also covered. But basically, probably the easiest way to describe Drova is a sort of top-down version of games like Gothic and things from Piranha Bytes, which is to say you start off very weak, but through the assistance of factions and leveling and slow acquisition of power, you become extraordinarily powerful and fight your way through the things that were terrifying at first as you navigate your way through a strange land. And basically, this game takes everything that made games like Gothic really good and compelling and manages to build on them successfully while also making an interesting world for you to explore. And as you move through it and you learn more and more about what is going on here and what you can do to improve your odds, and as that slowly turns in your favor, you get this extremely satisfying sense of progression, combined with the RPG elements of building out your character the way you want, but also which faction to join, which are going to help you navigate the strange powers of the world that manifests in the form of magic, more or less, all makes for a really compelling experience. I think it's a game that took what worked from Gothic and manages to build on it, which is itself a really remarkable thing, especially given that Piranha Bytes is closed down these days. But until we get the Gothic remake, if you want to play something similar, I do think Drova is a fantastic way to go. Keeping it moving though, because fourth up we've then got Space Wreck, another interesting little CRPG. Space Wreck is more of a scenario than anything else. It's not a terribly long game by any means, but it is incredibly reactive and replayable. You take on the role of a character basically just trying to get their stranded spaceship going again, and how you go about doing that, being either completely pacifist or sort of murder hobo across the confines of space, it's really up to you. But on average, each individual quest has like 5 or 6 ways of being completed based on your skills and how you've built out a character. There's just a million little things to explore, which makes it a short but extremely replayable situation where you can play through it just again and again while finding new things every time. And while it might not look like much, if you enjoy the types of RPGs I frequently feature, I would encourage you to give Space Wreck a try. It is significantly better than its looks would have you believe, and to that effect there's actually a demo over on Steam if you want to check it out for free. But speaking of strange but replayable games, probably as good a time as any to mention my sort of hear me out of video games, which is Betrayal at Club Low, because I'll be the first person to tell you basically nothing about Betrayal at Club Low looks particularly great. It's a very strange looking game, but it's also a fantastic little scenario type thing where you have to work your way through a whole host of situations that are intended to certainly be comedic, yes, but also manages to nail in a sort of microcosm a lot of what makes an RPG about choice and consequence really fun. Ultimately, this game tasks you as a agent working undercover to rescue someone who has been trapped at a nightclub. You do this by infiltrating the place as a pizza delivery guy, and you're going to use the pizzas that you can make with the various parts you find as you explore to adjust your pizza dice, which can then affect all of the different rolls you'll be making along the way as you explore the ins and outs of this nightclub, which leads to a whole host of different endings based on what you did or did not accomplish. And while it might seem simple enough, I can pretty much promise you that if you play Betrayal at Club Low, it'll likely be one of the most unique things you play. And actually, to that end, they are currently working on a sort of follow-up in the same universe called Moves of the Diamond Hand, which I plan on covering in the future. But either way, Betrayal at Club Low is fantastically strange, and it is one of my favorites for pretty much exactly that reason. But speaking of strange titles, we then have Delusion. Delusion is a game that I would say, thanks to a lot of its aesthetic, actually gets compared to Morrowind a lot, but personally I don't think that fits at all. Outside of some visuals here and there, I think that Delusion shares very little in common with Morrowind, but nonetheless, it is a really interesting game with a fantastic backstory that was incredibly interesting to get to the bottom of. You see, humanity has pretty much retreated to floating islands in the sky as the surface of the planet is broken and impassable, and given the state of the world, there is unsurprisingly upsetting things to discover and explore, like the undead kingdom that is feeding off of sort of lab-grown non-sentient flesh to keep them in check from rampaging across the Isles and trying to destroy all of the other civilizations. And there's also all of these weird occult things you can discover about the gods themselves, or the things that claim to be gods anyway, and then the apostates that work against them. And it all leads to this just incredibly interesting little story that will likely have you especially excited just to roam around and explore, which is encouraged by its progression systems, which basically give you upgrades to things via items you can find while exploring, and while there are certainly various mechanics that aren't exactly going to blow you away or anything, combat in particular, but also some simplistic elements in other places as well, which is definitely where you can feel the game being more on the indie side, it is still, in spite of those things, an incredibly compelling experience that is, I would say, probably going to stick with you afterwards, as it certainly did with me, which is why it's on this list, of course. Curiously, though, from what I understand, the people behind Dread Delusion, their next title is actually going to be a game called Entropy, which is a TRPG instead, so I may very well be covering that one in the future as well. But for now, that brings us to our final entry, and I would say there's a pretty good chance a lot of people guessed what this one was, because it's the game I've talked about on this list previously the most by far, and that is none other than Another Crab's Treasure. A bizarre little Souls-like about a hermit crab off to reclaim his stolen shell. It also incorporates a great deal of humor, but I like this game for a variety of reasons, and for starters, it is actually a competent Souls-like, but also isn't afraid to just kind of let the player have control of that experience with one of the funnier things you can do if you're having trouble. Just be sort of, whipping out a gun and one-shotting bosses with it, because the power of gun tends to win these fights, and that can lead to situations where if you're really struggling with a boss in terms of like beating it the normal way, instead of rage quitting, you can just sort of rage win, which is its own sort of funny. And then if that wasn't enough for you, it's also got a surprisingly good story. I've talked about this plenty of times in plenty of places, but the story of this game actually got to me in a way that was almost kind of annoying, because it was this silly little fun game about this crab going through some trials and tribulations only to actually wrap up with a meaning that actually managed to resonate with me, which is, I think, what cemented it as one of my favorite indie games of all time, for sure. But I think the really great thing about indie games in general is that chances are you have quite possibly had a very similar experience with a game I've never even heard of, because there are so many of these it's impossible to keep up with all of them. And so while these are my favorites that I have experienced, I would love to hear about yours down in the comments section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.